Somewhere down the line, maybe a year from now, maybe next week, you're going to be doing something completely ordinary. Washing a cup, driving a road you've driven 1,000 times, standing in a doorway you've stood in for years. And it's going to land on you quietly, almost casually, that you already made it through. That the thing you were certain would break you is behind you now. That you crossed the water while you were still convinced you were drowning in it. Nobody handed you a certificate. There was no moment where a voice announced that the trial was over and you could stop bracing. That's the strange thing about the deepest tests a human being goes through. They don't end with a bell. They end with a silence you don't trust yet. A stillness so unfamiliar that you keep waiting for the next wave, standing on solid ground with your whole body still tensed for water. Carl Jung spent his life mapping this exact territory, and he came to believe that the most important passages in a person's life almost never arrive with fanfare. He described something he called the night sea journey, an image he drew from old myths about the hero who gets swallowed by the darkness, dragged beneath the surface, carried through the belly of something enormous and lightless, and then, against all expectation, delivered onto a far shore. Changed. Older in some invisible way. Carrying something they didn't have before. What Jung understood, and what almost no one tells you, is that the journey doesn't feel like a heroic myth while you're inside it. It feels like disintegration. It feels like failure. It feels like the slow, humiliating collapse of everything you built to keep yourself safe. And the moment you emerge, dripping and disoriented on the other bank, you're usually too exhausted to realize the water is behind you. So today I want to talk to you as someone standing a little further up the path, looking back at where you are. I want to show you what the test actually was, because it probably wasn't the thing you think. I want to show you why no one is going to announce that you passed it. And I want to show you what changes now, on this side of the water, and why the disorientation you're feeling isn't a sign that you failed. It's the first sensation of standing on ground that no longer moves. Let's start with the test itself, because most people misunderstand it completely. When your life falls apart, when the relationship ends, the identity cracks, the meaning drains out of things that used to hold you together, you assume the test is survival. Can you endure it? Can you keep going? Can you white-knuckle your way through the pain without falling completely apart? And so you grit your teeth and you brace, and you wait for the difficulty to pass, thinking that outlasting it is the whole point. But Jung watched hundreds of people move through these collapses, and he noticed that endurance was never the real test. Plenty of people endure. They survive terrible things and emerge completely unchanged, harder than before, more defended, more certain that the world is dangerous and that they were right to armor themselves against it. Survival on its own doesn't transform anyone. You can live through the night sea journey and crawl back onto the same shore you left from, having learned nothing except how to hold your breath longer. The actual test was something quieter and much harder to see. It was whether, in the middle of everything falling apart, you would finally stop performing. Whether you'd let the version of yourself that everyone approved of dissolve without immediately rebuilding it. Whether you could tolerate not knowing who you were long enough for something truer to surface. The test wasn't the pain. The test was what you did with the space the pain opened up. Think about what that space actually felt like. There came a point where the strategy stopped working. The people-pleasing didn't earn you the safety it used to. The achievement didn't fill the emptiness. The story you told yourself about who you were and why your life looked the way it did stopped holding together. And in that gap, you had a choice you probably didn't even recognize as a choice. You could scramble to rebuild the old self as fast as possible, or you could stay in the uncertainty and let something real grow in the dark. If you're on the other side now, and I suspect you are, or something in you wouldn't have stopped to listen to this, then at some point, maybe without ever deciding it consciously, you chose the second path. You stopped auditioning for a life that was never yours. You let a mask come off even though you had no idea what your actual face looked like underneath it. That was the test. And the fact that you're feeling lost rather than triumphant is exactly why you didn't notice you'd passed. Jung had a phrase for what a person wins on the far side of this ordeal. He called it the treasure hard to attain. In the old myths, the hero descends into the cave or the underworld or the belly of the beast, and what they bring back isn't gold in any literal sense. It's something interior, a capacity, a knowing, a relationship with their own depths that they simply did not have before they went under. The treasure is hard to attain precisely because the only way to reach it is through the descent. There's no shortcut, no way to acquire it while staying comfortable and intact. And here's the part that catches everyone off guard. The treasure doesn't announce itself. You don't surface from the water clutching something obvious. You surface empty-handed, convinced you lost everything. And only much later do you realize that what you brought back was a different way of being alive. A steadiness that doesn't depend on things going well. A center that holds even when the external supports fall away. It took root in the dark, where you couldn't watch it grow. Let me put this in something you can feel. Picture a woman in her 40s who spent her entire life being the one everyone leaned on. The competent one. The one who managed everyone's emotions so skillfully that no one ever noticed she had any of her own. And then, over the course of a brutal couple of years, it all comes apart. A marriage, a job, a sense of who she was supposed to be. She spends months barely functioning, certain she's failing at life, certain that the woman she used to be has been destroyed and nothing has replaced her. What she can't see, in the middle of it, is that the competent woman was a performance she'd been trapped inside since childhood. She can't see that the collapse is the performance ending. She thinks she's losing herself. She's actually meeting herself, maybe for the first time. And the reason it feels like death is that something genuinely is dying. Just not the part of her she thinks. The part that's dying is the mask. The part that's terrified is the mask, fighting for its life the way anything fights when it senses the end coming. That's the confusion at the heart of every night sea journey. The thing that feels like it's being destroyed and the thing that's actually being born are so tangled together that you can't tell them apart while it's happening. You mourn the loss of a self that was never really you, and you don't recognize the arrival of the self that was underneath the whole time, because you've never met that self before, and it doesn't come with a name or a story you already know. Now, why does no one tell you that you passed? Why isn't there a moment of recognition, a signal, a sense of arrival? Jung believed this was one of the cruelest features of genuine transformation, and also one of the most important. Because if the change announced itself, you'd immediately hand it over to your ego. You'd turn it into an achievement, a story about how strong you are, a new identity to perform. You'd take the raw, quiet, living thing you became and stuff it into the same old machinery of proving yourself to the world. The silence protects the transformation. The absence of applause is what keeps you honest. On the far shore, there's no audience, no witness, no one confirming that you did it right. And that solitude forces you to develop something you never had to develop when you were performing for approval. An internal sense of what's true, independent of whether anyone else sees it or names it or claps. That's not a punishment. That's the whole point. The loneliness of the far bank is where you finally learn to stand without leaning. I want you to sit with how counterintuitive that is. Everything in the culture around you is built on the opposite premise, that growth should be visible, celebrated, posted, validated. That if a change is real, Other people should be able to see it and reflect it back to you. And here's Jung, quietly insisting that the most profound change you'll ever go through happens in a place where no one can follow you and no one can confirm what occurred. You come back knowing something you can't fully prove, and part of the maturity you gained is no longer needing to prove it. If any of this is landing in your body, if you recognize the far shore even though no one ever gave it a name, you might find something useful in a guide we put together called True Self-Discovery. It's 24 reflection exercises built from Jung's approach to exactly this territory: the quiet after the crossing, the disorientation of standing on new ground, the slow work of getting to know the self that surfaced. It's meant to keep you company in the silence rather than fill it with noise. The link is right below this video. But stay with me, because what happens on this side of the water is the part almost no one prepares you for. The first thing that changes is your relationship to fear. Not that fear disappears, it doesn't. And anyone who tells you enlightenment means the end of fear is selling you something. What changes is that fear loses its authority over you. Before the crossing, fear was the invisible government of your life. It made your decisions for you, dressed up as caution, as practicality, as being realistic. You stayed in situations that were slowly killing you because the fear of leaving was louder than the pain of staying. Fear ran the whole operation and convinced you it was just common sense. But when you've already been through the thing you were most afraid of, when the collapse you spent years trying to prevent actually happened, and you're still here, fear can't threaten you the same way anymore. You've called its bluff. You know, not as an idea, but as a lived fact in your bones, that you can survive the loss of the very things you thought you couldn't live without. And a person who knows that in their body is almost impossible to control. Fear still speaks, but you've heard its worst, and you're standing on the other side of it, so its voice no longer decides where you go. Jung saw this shift as one of the clearest markers that someone had truly crossed over. They stopped organizing their entire existence around the avoidance of pain. They started making decisions from a different place, from what was actually true for them rather than from what would keep them safe. And to the people still living inside their fear, this looks reckless, even irresponsible. But it isn't recklessness. It's the natural way of moving through the world for someone who has stopped believing that safety is the highest good. The second thing that changes is how you relate to the people who knew the old you. This one is harder, and it's where a lot of the loneliness of the far shore actually comes from. The people around you built their relationship with a specific version of you, the one who overgave, who never said no, who managed their feelings, who stayed small enough not to threaten anyone. And when you come back from the crossing as someone who no longer performs that role, they feel it, even if they can't name it. Something they relied on isn't available anymore. Some of them will adjust. The relationships that were built on something real will survive the change, maybe even deepen, because now they're connecting to an actual person instead of a performance. But some of them won't be able to follow you across the water, and Jung was honest about this in a way most people avoid. Certain relationships were held together entirely by the role you played in them. When you stop playing the role, there's nothing left to hold them together. And watching those connections thin out and fall away is one of the real costs of the transformation. A cost you couldn't have known you'd pay until you were already paying it. Here's what I want you to understand about that, though, from a little further up the path. The relationships that end because you stopped shrinking were never actually connections. They were arrangements. Someone got something from the version of you that disappeared, and when the supply stopped, so did their interest. That's painful to see clearly. It's also freeing, because it means the loneliness you feel on the far shore isn't the loss of love. It's the loss of transactions that were only ever pretending to be love. and the space they leave behind is where genuine connection finally becomes possible. The third thing that changes is your relationship with time, and this one is subtle enough that you might not notice it for a while. Before the crossing, you probably lived in a kind of permanent anticipation, always reaching toward the next thing that would finally make you okay, the next achievement, the next relationship, the next version of your life where everything would click into place and you could finally rest. You were never actually here, because here was always just a staging ground for a better there that stayed permanently out of reach. When you come through the night sea journey, that forward-leaning hunger quiets down. Not because you stop wanting things, but because you stopped believing that your okayness was located in the future. You went all the way down into the worst of it, and you discovered that the ground held, that there was something in you that remained even when everything you were reaching for was stripped away. And once you know that, the desperate reaching loses its grip. You can be here. You can stand on this shore and actually feel the ground under your feet instead of scanning the horizon for the next place to run. Jung described the person who completes this passage as someone who develops a relationship with what he called the self, the deeper center of the psyche that exists beneath the constructed personality. And the mark of that relationship is a strange, quiet steadiness, a sense of being rooted in something that circumstances can't take away. These people become harder to knock over, not because they've hardened, but because their center of gravity moved from the outside world to somewhere inside, somewhere the world can't reach. But I don't want to make this sound like a rival, like you cross the water once and stand in permanent peace for the rest of your life. That's not how any of this works, and Jung was clear about it. The far shore isn't a destination where the work is finished. It's more like a new baseline, a different relationship to the whole process of being alive. You'll go through other descents. There will be other nights, other waters. What changes is that you now know the shape of the thing. You've done it once. And a person who has been through the dark and come out the other side carries a different kind of trust into the next darkness. This is where the disorientation you might be feeling right now actually makes sense. Because the space between chapters, the stretch where the old self is gone and the new one hasn't fully consolidated, is genuinely uncomfortable, and it can last longer than you expect. You're standing on the far bank, and you don't yet know how to live here. The old maps don't work. The old goals feel hollow. The things that used to motivate you have lost their pull, and nothing has clearly risen to replace them. And in that emptiness, it's easy to conclude that something is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. What you're experiencing is the perfectly natural condition of someone who has just crossed a threshold and hasn't yet built a life on the other side of it. The emptiness isn't the absence of a future. It's the fertile, uncomfortable space where a future that's actually yours can finally take shape. One that doesn't come from inherited expectations or borrowed definitions of success, but from an honest encounter with who you turned out to be when everything false burned away. That space feels like nothing because you've never stood in a space this open before. Every other version of your life was already furnished before you got there. There's a temptation in this stretch that I want to warn you about, because Jung watched so many people give into it and lose the very thing they'd suffered so much to gain. The temptation is to rush, to grab the first available identity, the first new relationship, the first shiny purpose that promises to end the discomfort of not knowing. The emptiness is so uncomfortable that people fill it with almost anything, just to feel like themselves again. And in doing so, they build the next chapter out of panic instead of truth, and they end up right back in a life that doesn't fit, wondering why the peace didn't last. The work now, and it's real work, even though it doesn't look like it from the outside, is to resist that rush. To let the far shore stay open a little longer than is comfortable. To move slowly enough that what you build next actually comes from the self that surfaced rather than the self that drowned. You crossed the water. Don't undo the crossing by immediately reconstructing the person you were before you went under. The whole point was that that person couldn't stay. Let them go. If you're sitting in exactly that in-between right now, across the water but not yet at home on the new ground, the True Self-Discovery Guide was built for precisely this stretch. The 24 reflection exercises aren't there to rush you toward some tidy answer about who you are now. They're there to help you listen to what's still forming, to stay in the open space without panicking, to let the new self arrive on its own timeline instead of forcing a shape onto it too soon. If that feels like something you could use, you'll find it linked below. Let me tell you about the quality that Jung believed defined a person who had truly completed the passage, because it's not what most people expect. It's not confidence, exactly. It's not peace in the greeting card sense. It's something he described as the capacity to hold opposites without needing to resolve them, the ability to feel sorrow and gratitude in the same breath, to see the darkness in a good situation and the gift buried in a painful one, to stop demanding that life sort itself into simple categories of good and bad, success and failure, right and wrong. Before the crossing, you probably needed things to be one thing or another. You needed the story to be clean. You needed to know whether you were the victim or at fault, whether a decision was right or wrong, whether your life was working or not. That need for resolution is exhausting, and it flattens everything, because real life is never that clean. And one of the quiet gifts you bring back from the night sea journey is the ability to stand in complexity without falling apart, to let two contradictory things be true at once, and to find that far more honest than any tidy answer you used to cling to. You'll notice it in small ways at first. Someone who hurt you badly will do something kind, and instead of your whole story about them collapsing, you'll simply hold both, the harm and the kindness, existing in the same person, without needing to decide which one is the real them. A chapter of your life you spent years regretting will reveal something it taught you, and you'll feel the regret and the gratitude sitting side by side, neither one canceling the other out. That's the treasure hard to attain, showing up in the texture of ordinary days. Not a dramatic revelation, a different way of holding what's already there. And here's something worth naming directly, because it's easy to miss. The reason you can hold all of that now is that you held it in yourself first. You had to face the parts of you that you'd spent a lifetime rejecting, the anger you weren't allowed to have, the needs you learned to hide, the selfishness underneath your endless giving, the whole shadow of everything you buried to be acceptable. The descent forced you to meet those parts and, eventually, to stop treating them as enemies. And a person who has made peace with their own contradictions can finally tolerate the contradictions in everyone and everything else. You extend outward the mercy you were forced to grow inward. So where does that leave you, standing on this shore, still not entirely sure the water is behind you? I think it leaves you with a task that's much gentler than the one you just completed, but no less important. The task now isn't to survive. You already did that. The task now is to recognize what happened, to stop waiting for the announcement that isn't coming and start acting as if you already passed, because you did. To turn around, finally, and look at how far the shore is behind you, and let yourself feel the full weight of the fact that you crossed it. Because here's what I've noticed about people at this exact point in the journey. They keep living as if the test is still ongoing. They keep bracing. They keep waiting for permission to relax, for someone to tell them it's safe now, for external confirmation that they made it. And in doing so, they stay trapped in the tension of the crossing long after the crossing is done, standing on dry ground with their whole body still fighting a current that isn't there anymore. The last piece of the transformation is letting yourself believe it happened. Jung would tell you that this recognition isn't a passive thing. It's a choice you have to make, and keep making. The choice to inhabit the self that surfaced, instead of endlessly grieving the one that drowned. The choice to build the next chapter from truth, instead of fear. The choice to stop performing even now, even here, when there's no one on the far bank to perform for. Every day you make that choice, you take one more step inland, away from the water, into the actual life that's waiting for you on this side. And that life is going to look different than the one you left. Quieter, maybe, in ways that feel strange before they feel free. Smaller in some places, because you've let go of the relationships and the ambitions that were only ever about proving you were enough. But bigger in the ways that matter, more honest, more your own, more able to hold both the sorrow and the joy without flinching from either. You didn't survive the night sea journey to rebuild the cage you escaped. You survived it to finally live outside it. So the next time you catch yourself bracing for the next wave, standing in that ordinary doorway, waiting for the ground to give way beneath you again, I want you to do one thing. Turn around. Look at the water behind you. Notice how far it is. Notice that you're standing on ground that hasn't moved in a long time. And let yourself understand quietly, without needing anyone else to say it, that the test is over. You passed it while you were still convinced you were failing. And everything on this side of the water is yours to build now, for the first time, as the person you actually are. If you haven't yet, take a look at the True Self Discovery Guide, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, made for exactly this stretch of the road, the disoriented, hopeful space just after the crossing. A way to start recognizing the self that surfaced, and to build what comes next from truth instead of fear. The link is right below this video.